Disclaimer: I am not native to Scandinavia, and so I apologise in advance for any words or names I may mispronounce. In addition to this, I also want to apologise for the quality, as I am without the equipment I would usually use due to the COVID-19 outbreak. Enjoy. There are stories that have been lost to time. Stories we wish we could look back on and derive some sort of semblance as to what life may have been like for those that first told them. In some cases, all we can do is wish and long for the knowledge. That being said, there are certain tales that were passed down through generations. These provide a basis for us to understand the enigmatic lives of those that have long since passed. We can see through them what these people believed. To many, a storm would be simply that. But to them, a clap of thunder had a very different meaning. Thor is on his way, riding through the clouds on his goat-drawn carriage. When people think of the Vikings, a few of the first words that come to mind are raider, pillager, killer. But they were more than that. Scavengers, farmers, civilized. A lot of what they truly were has been lost due to ignorance, misunderstanding, or simply blindly trusting in a single source. Whilst it is true that the Vikings were in no way a picnic to deal with, they certainly were not as bad as they're made out to be. The Norsemen couldn't write, and so couldn't record their own history. Most of what we know was written down by the monks, a group of people the Vikings didn't necessarily treat overly well. If they weren't being enslaved, they were being slaughtered. The Vikings had a simple way of doing things. If you were in the way of what they wanted, then they would move you by any means necessary. And so the monks didn't look upon the Vikings with particularly good thoughts. You could imagine what they wrote, and what we have in order to decrypt history, is all rather bleak and horrifying. Because what the monks saw is only part of who the Vikings were. Any person, whether they live now or in the late 700s, are more than two-dimensional. Everyone has a personality, a way of life, and a way of thinking. Just because you may work in a fast food chain or teach for a living does not mean that all you do every day is teach or serve food. Being a Viking was like that. It was a job for these people. In actual fact, they weren't even really Vikings. Viking is actually an Old Norse noun meaning overseas exploration. So let's suppose it is a job, and the job details are explore overseas. The salary are the treasures they bring home. This isn't how it worked, mind you. Any treasures would be given to the chieftain, and they would then dispense back what each Viking deserved based on their ranking. But let's pretend for a second it is as simple as bringing home the treasures. Once they are home and no longer at work, the Norsemen would acclimatise themselves back to Scandinavian life. Archaeological finds, such as coins, tell us that the Vikings were far more civilised than the monks gave them credit for. What has been found and what has been written about the Vikings is only a part of what gives us our knowledge on them. What's left comes from Old Norse beliefs. The Nordic gods played a huge part in the lives of the Vikings, inspiring many of their traditions and how they lived. To understand the Vikings, we first need to understand the deities they worshipped, both those that played a major role in Norse mythology and those that weren't as prevalent. I've decided to write a short story series deriving from Nordic mythology, in an effort to inform and educate people on the lesser known deities. This includes events that occurred within the mythology. Ragnarok is something a lot of people have heard of, but even Ragnarok is without its full potential amongst mainstream media. When I posted a little snippet of what I'd written though, I immediately received backlash. People were saying that I couldn't steal Ragnarok and that I shouldn't bastardize it more than it had already been. I understand the hesitance in hearing that yet another author is planning on, as one person put it, jumping on the Norse myths bandwagon, especially if you are someone who wants to preserve the truth as much as possible. It is understandable, as there are so many people that did and still do worship the Norse gods. Ragnarok is part of a rich and full culture that doesn't in any way deserve to be picked apart and used to create something different, which is why I want to tell its truth. What only a select few people know about me, and I now suppose people listening to this, is that I am one of those pagans that believe in the Norse gods with everything I have. To that person that tried to tell me I'm stealing Ragnarok and that I'm bastardizing it, I say to you, no, I'm not. Ragnarok doesn't belong to anybody, and it certainly is not something anyone would want to claim for themselves. It's real and terrifying. I'm not stripping it apart for my own gain. I'm trying to educate people on what it actually is. Yes, I talk about it in a piece of fiction, but that doesn't make it any less true. By mixing the truth into a fictional story, I'm opening minds to the idea of something that is outside of the everyday norm in a creative way. Ragnarok shaped the lives of the Old Norse people more than most anything else, and it continues to do so to this day. For those of you that don't quite know what Ragnarok is, it's the end of days. The end of gods and men alike. It's the apocalypse, really. If you think of Norse mythology as a chronological set of events, then naturally Ragnarok is the end. However, what a lot of people don't know is that life is foreseen to continue after Ragnarok. It is worth noting that there are multiple accounts of Ragnarok being mentioned in different sources, and not all of the information agrees with each other. For this reason, I'm going to talk about what is known and agreed upon the most widely. A few of the gods that are said to have survived are Njord, Heinir, Balder, Hod, Vidar, Magni, and Modi. The only goddess that is said to have survived is the daughter of the personification of the sun. Something that the Old Norsemen believed is that the soul of the deceased stays within the family and is passed on through descendants. Due to this, it made sense to them that the survivors would be important to the new world. Magni and Modi are the sons of Thor, someone I'm sure that most people would know of due to pop culture. They are said to inherit Thor's hammer, Mjolnir, after Thor dies in Ragnarok. This is noteworthy when you learn that Mjolnir often more than just a hammer. It was used to bless events that held a significant importance, two of these being marriages and births. Due to this, it's safe to see why the Norsemen may look up to some of those lesser known gods, especially considering after Ragnarok, Magni and Modi would be two of the gods vital to rebuilding the world. Likened to Magni and Modi, Vidar also survived and was incredibly reputable when it came to his actions during Ragnarok. Vidar is the son of Odin himself. He risked everything in order to avenge his father's death, becoming one of the bravest gods to have survived. Whilst we're talking about the sons of Odin, Balder and Hod were also his sons. Considering what I've already said about how the Norsemen believed an ancestor's soul to be passed down, that would mean that Odin's soul would have passed to each of his three sons that survived, making these three gods that aren't very well known vital to the new world. In the eyes of the Norsemen, another pivotal god to have survived but isn't as well known now is Heinir. He is described to have helped create mankind with Odin in some versions of the creation of the cosmos. It isn't really known how he survived Ragnarok, though we know he did because he is portrayed as casting divination shards in the wake of its end. Again, an incredibly important god to have on your side at the end of the world. He'd done it before, he can rebuild it again. In addition to those already mentioned, Njord also survived, though he is a little more known in the eyes of those that live now, and wasn't really prophesied to have much to do with rebuilding the world. In fact, he is described as simply returning to Vanaheim, the home of the Vanir, upon the world's end. Sadly, the only information I've managed to gather on any goddesses surviving is limited. The one that I do know of doesn't seem to have been named. Ragnarok itself is said to be preceded with freezing winters and pandemonium. All sorts of creatures and giants will begin closing in on the gods as the wolves, Skull and Hati, who have been chasing the personifications of the sun and the moon since the very beginning of time, will finally catch up and devour their quarry. Everything in the skies will go out, leaving the world in total darkness. Despite the gods fully knowing of the prophecies and what the future is foretold for them, they decide to go to battle. The battlefield in which they fight being called Vigrid. This is Old Norse for plain where battle surges. From the fighting and the flames, the earth sinks into the sea, killing even mankind. That being said, the earth will rise again, hosting those that manage to survive. This is all something that people don't know about Ragnarok. Yes, there are those people that do know, and there are some people that have done their research, but if you're just going off of that Marvel film, then you won't know what actually happened, or what's to happen. Ragnarok doesn't have a specific time. It could have happened already, it could still happen, which is what makes it so terrifying. The Vikings in particular lived their lives in accordance to Ragnarok. They did everything they believed Odin would want in a warrior. It's said that if someone were to die in battle, then Odin would welcome them into his afterlife hall of Valhalla. From here they wait for Ragnarok, where Odin has been prophesied to die. Regardless of this, he will lead Valhalla into the battle. When I think about Norse gods that the Vikings and Scandinavians in general looked up to, but aren't immensely popular or well known in today's media, Bragi comes to mind. Bragi is the Norse god of poetry. Now when you think Viking, as I mentioned earlier, the first thoughts that might come to mind are certainly not poetry, eloquence or music. But the truth is that they were quite a creative set of people. One thing in particular that possibly drew the Norsemen into following in Bragi's example was the fact that he may not have started out as a god, but rather a mere mortal from the 9th century. Different sources say different things, but he seems to always be regarded as the son of Odin. None of the legends definitively identify Bragi as either a god or not, though. This makes sense in retrospect. Who else's shadow would you want to follow in, but someone who had managed to become a god? When it comes to the goddesses, it becomes clear that the people who wrote the myths didn't have much to say about them. Many didn't even have a personality. Take Sif, for example. She's someone who people would know from pop culture, but the Sif in the Thor film is nothing like the real Sif. In fact, the only defining feature she had was her hair. When you do the research and you do your best to learn as much as possible about these goddesses, despite the difficulty, it becomes clear that the Scandinavian women based their entire lives on these goddesses. For example, the goddess Ellie, who is the personification of old age. Despite her age, she retains her strength, and so when challenged by Thor, manages to best him. This level of strength is something that the Old Norse women valued and put into everything they did. Something said to Thor in regards to Ellie was, "You contested with old age who defeats everyone, despite their strength." This is something that not only the women took into consideration, but the men as well. In this age it was uncommon to see anyone really living past 30, and so old age wasn't something they necessarily thought about. That being said, it makes sense to assume that this quote from the Gylfaginning is linked to death in general, because you just can't avoid such a thing. Despite this, it's also understandable that the goddess Ellie isn't very popular in the minds of the modern world, as she didn't really show up too much within Norse mythology. I wish I could talk more on this topic, however that is everything I have to say in this current moment. I may make a follow-up to this providing it is well received with much better quality and a guest like I planned for this one. That plan was sadly made difficult because of the coronavirus outbreak and lockdown. I hope you're all staying safe, washing your hands thoroughly and staying indoors. We will all get through this together. It's just a case of being there for yourselves and your families, even if it is over the phone, and supporting anybody on the front line by staying as safe as we possibly can. Thank you so much for listening. I've been your host, Beth Porter, and this was Speculative Superstitions.